You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here in our second week discussing Bruce Hamilton's Too Much of Water, chapters 5 to 8. Herds is solving this one, a classic murder mystery from the 1950s. This one set aboard the boat Goyaz on its way down past the southwestern tip of Europe, on its way to the Bahamas.
The Bahamas. That's definitely where this is going. That's a piece of information I've internalized. I'm having a great time. We've had multiple murders with bodies at this point in the story. There's really a lot of tension that's ratcheting up.
The thing I wanted to start with, Herds, is this is the first book in the entire run of the show that we've had, correct me if I'm wrong, where a child has died on screen as one of the victims.
It's impressive because when they introduce Esteban Braha is a very annoying child who, when introduced, I was like, wow, we're really going out of our way to establish how frustrating this kid is and how he has this little toy train that like runs over. I think it's Annie's feet because she's the one that we bully all the time. It's her role. It's her role in the ship. It's great so that Edgar can save her constantly.
Yes.
But Esteban, I was thinking he must be like on the ship so that he can notice a clue later on that nobody else would have noticed.
Nope, turns out he's there to die.
He's got some kind of brain problem and they're taking him to get experimental surgery. Yeah, he's there to get killed in a swimming pool and the ladder gets knocked off.
I don't actually entirely understand what the mechanism that sets up the swimming pool on this boat is, but it's like
What do you mean?
A pack up and pack down thing with a ladder that makes it inescapable.
Yeah, the ladder is able to be disassembled. It's not like built into the side of the pool. The mechanism is to lead Bridger, the guy in charge of the investigation, who's trying to keep things civil. He talks a lot about how, oh, well, maybe this could have possibly slipped and hit his head on the ladder and knocked it off. And it's all very contrived, isn't it? And we know we're in a murder mystery.
Yeah.
It's a bold move to slaughter a child.
Interestingly, seemingly the second murder we've had that is sort of like tied to someone who reads as what we would in the modern day call neurodivergent. Mr. Rottentosser is a man with a firm, robust set of interests who doesn't understand social cues. The kid is kind of the same. I don't think it's what the book was trying to explore, but it definitely does read a bit differently these days, I think.
As I kind of alluded to with my Annie comment, there's definitely some politics in this book that I think are not progressive. I like that we call out the Nazis. That's always fun. But in terms of people with mental differences, we're not being kind to them. We're very kind to women, though, because Edgar has to show that he cares about people. So he defends women a lot.
Although the thing that is interesting is that it's not like hostile, but it sort of just does go out of its way to make it a moment.
I hope that that's how it stays. I think it's quite unfortunate, but it's symptomatic of the comedy in the book. Like, obviously, we're not being hostile to these characters, but we're using their mental tics and strange obsessions to kind of make them more difficult for the other characters to deal with and thereby create tension that isn't, oh, I'm going to go out of my way to put a wasp in your drink. It's more like we're having communication breakdowns and differences of interest, and that's causing funny situations.
It's not a book that is cruel, but through using it for comedy comes across as very unkind.
It's very flippant, I think, with its subject matter, which is not a great look. Thankfully, I don't think that Mr. Sweet is what we would call neurodivergent. He's our third kill on the boat. I think he's just annoying. I wasn't expecting him to die just because he's kind of fallen off my radar, but he was the potential Nazi, so we can't feel too bad about him. You might even say that all the characters who've died so far have been kind of a bunch of buttholes, but let's not.
Yeah, I mean, like, Sweet is kind of a cruel character, no matter where you actually dissect his political allegiances. Like, his job is as the operator of a youth center, and basically the way that he describes going about his job is that he just makes sure that we are spending the money most effectively. Read subtext as not on the pause.
Only on the members of the institution that matter,
Yes.
Of course. That's a part of the book, right? That we're dealing with the best and brightest, but there are some characters who are less bright than others in the social sense.
You are right in what you're pointing towards there, and that the book does try to be like very flippant with what's going on here. Like, a child dies and it's sort of set up as a scene right after the child has like annoyed this man and he's dived into the ocean to save his cat.
Yeah, the kid literally throws a poor cat overboard.
It's all very slapstick.
The novel's going out of its way to kind of limit the impact of the death scenes. Sweet's just died. I don't really care. Rottentosser, I kind of cared. There was a lot of drama kind of attached to that sequence. And the kid dying is given some level of drama, but as you say, it's right after literally showing that the kid is Satan incarnate by trying to murder a poor cat. And then his parents
they have like no reaction.
He had to die at some point. This was fine. Let's just not read into it and kind of get on with the boat ride. That's the atmosphere that the staff wants to foster as well. They do the classic investigative sequence where we say, well, it couldn't have been any of the staff members. It must be one of the named characters.
Falls apart a little bit, but considering that we opened by like naming a lot of the staff, but
yeah, like I wouldn't even say silly, I'd say stupid.
It's also going for the sort of thing where they're trying to convince everyone that these are accidents when everyone is already very much aware that these are not accidents.
They've said multiple times, like, how could this even happen? But they try to flip-flop it and say, oh yeah, well, maybe it's just like kids just die in the pool, which, I mean, is a reality.
Yeah.
I lived in a house with a pool as a kid, and the amount of security we have around that thing is ludicrous.
Shout out to effective safety legislature.
Shout out to locked gates.
One of the disinteresting things about this slice of chapters is that so much of what is effectively the middle act, the climax of this book, the rising action towards the final death, we suppose, is like bogged down with the procedure of letting everyone know that these are accidents when, as I say, they're aware that they're not. So much text is spent not even getting clues out of characters, like the alibis that they prepare for everyone. We get this like big grid of when everyone could have possibly committed the crimes, and all of the like actual evidence taking and scenes where they are interrogating those characters to get that information is like written in montage.
It's a bit strange. Also, the grid that they prepare, it tries to narrow it down to maybe 3 suspects. They say, well, there are only 4 people that could have feasibly had the time to commit all 3 murders. And like one of those is a woman, so we should probably discount them. We shouldn't do that, but maybe we should, it's whatever. So they really only narrowed down to a couple of characters, and surprise, surprise, it's like Maurice and Gott, our 2 like love triangle men, of course. But it's fine. I like it when novels, they call attention to the cold hard facts of the case. There's a little timeline they give us, and obviously having another character list with the number of opportunities or the likelihood that they're the killer is always helpful to kind of reset the reader, and also to flag to me that like this is the point at which we're supposed to be able to solve things, which is nice.
I do actually think, as like the expert in this chair, that there is a level of hidden elegance to that grid, but it's not something that I think comes naturally out of the text unless for some reason you were choosing to read this book twice, which as always we would recommend doing on a show with a murder mystery book, but I could easily see how this could be like a point of contention for someone if they were just kind of cruising through this book.
I'm excited to hear about that elegance in the third part, because I don't think it's particularly elegant right now, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
The other thing that we should talk about is that there's a bit of a like thematic going through all of these murders. Like it's all kind of knocks to the back of the head and they're drowned. And it's sort of implied that even though we didn't see Mr. Rottentoss's death, that was also the case for him going overboard.
Yeah, you're right. There's a theme there of skullduggery, perhaps cunning in terms of playing the murder mystery game. I am very curious about the fact that everybody keeps getting drowned, but I think I might have just thought of something in the moment.
Well, I suppose we'll discuss that in a second.
We'll discuss that in a second. But yeah, you're right. Like the novel is really going out of its way. Obviously, it's a boat murder, so
we do have limited means, but like they're the same.
There are limited
means
of death. You could have like killed someone in the kitchen or someone in the engine room and somebody in the pool, but no, they're all being drowned, which is remarkable consistency there.
Yeah, especially for Mr. Sweet, who's like found in a bathtub, which meant that the killer presumably would have either had to accost him while he was having a bath, which seems deeply inconvenient, or filled up the bath after killing him, which seems deeply inconvenient.
Yeah, it's like some sort of obsession with a particular mode of murder. I do like themed killings. I don't know if it's quite the same as like wrapping a bag around someone's head and filling it with ash. It's not quite as evocative as that.
You really have Benjamin Stevenson's work on the brain at the moment.
I do. It's good work. Go read Benjamin Stevenson's Everyone series.
It is very good. By the way, I know this is the most tenuous connection I could possibly make, but there was one thing early in the book that I just had to mention that I don't feel is relevant in any way aside from being like deeply hilarious, which is the extremely roundabout way they go in describing Maurice Marcus as definitely not gay.
What? I don't know that I picked up on this. Please explain.
There's this bit early in the book because Maurice Marcus is like a colleague of Edgar's who they just happen to be on the same boat together. And he's like, oh, yes, he's a countertenor. And most people would believe that countertenors are of a disputable sexual persuasion. But Maurice, he's a bit of a Casanova. It's like, why are we going so out of our way to ensure that this character is not gay in the fiction?
Unless it happens on screen, it doesn't exist. So, look, they need to do more to assuade me of my gaydar going off.
I was really hoping when they both sat down in a room together that it was going to be like, he's not gay, and then they made out, and that was just going to be it.
They're just a couple? Wouldn't that be incredible? Wouldn't that actually be the best twist in this entire book?
I don't know where it could possibly be going, but it was so strange when they said it.
Good Lord.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. We are discussing Too Much of Water by Bruce Hamilton, chapters 5 to 8. We'll be back with more of that in just a second. Stick around on your Murder Mystery World Tour. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are once again graced on the program by Martin Edwards. He is a Diamond Dagger winner, member and chair of the Detection Club, author of crime fiction, historian of crime fiction, amid so many other things, and it is always a delight to welcome him to the show. So Martin, welcome back to Death of the Reader.
Well, great to be back with you.
I guess the thing I wanted to get started in is in The Life of Crime, your latest non-fiction release on the world of crime fiction. Chapter 25 describes Bruce Hamilton, our current feature author, as a missing link in the world of crime fiction. What does that mean, Martin?
I think that Bruce Hamilton is an interesting writer. Of course, he's been overshadowed. He was during his life, and he's certainly been overshadowed since then by his more famous brother Patrick, who wrote two enormously successful plays with a criminal theme, also a number of very distinguished novels. But Bruce himself was a really interesting writer. He had a fascinating relationship with Patrick. They influenced each other. They were very close. Bruce actually wrote a biography of Patrick as well. And I think his own fiction, although it has a number of flaws, it's interesting for a number of reasons, but particularly because it's ambitious and it's pretty different. And when I say I think of him as a missing link, I'm thinking of the link between the traditional Golden Age mysteries of the 20s and 30s, and then the darker psychological fiction that came into prominence after the Second World War, likes of Patricia Highsmith and so on. And Bruce kind of bridges that gap in a number of ways.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting looking at the way not only that it is so distinctly post-Golden Age, but that it is perhaps openly metatextual about that fact. There's comments in Too Much of Water about the fact that, we don't do those hangings anymore. Everyone got a bit sick of that after the war.
You're absolutely right. There is something quite knowing about Bruce. And he was a great experimenter. I think it's fair to say a lot of his experiments didn't necessarily come off quite as he hoped. But another link he had with the past was that his godfather was none other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Oh, there you go.
I think that's a fascinating connection. And in fact, I have here the American edition of his first book, To Be Hanged, and he actually prizes a blurb out of Sir Arthur, who was in fact sadly near his end, but he did come up with the goods and gave Bruce a quote. So it's quite interesting, almost 100 years later, to see that this practice of blurbs from more famous authors is a marketing ploy that's been around for a very, very long time.
Yeah. It's also so interesting too, because I think so much of what you go into in The Life of Crime is that there are all of these little connections between authors that we know so well in the world of crime, and little links that kind of disappear all over the place. I guess for the Hamilton brothers, you mentioned that they provide that missing link, but what is it you think makes them stand out amongst their contemporaries of post-Golden Age authors in terms of that foothold that they provide in that changing of the guard?
Well, I think there are a number of elements to this. They have an interest in the macabre, but as well as this interest in the macabre, they have an interest in character, in the psychology of crime. And this is famously true of Patrick, but it's also true of Bruce. And in his second book, Hue and Cry, is extraordinary because the protagonist is a professional footballer, a soccer player, and that just didn't happen in Agatha Christie. So there's something rooted in talking about real lives of real people. This is a guy from the north of England who plays football and then becomes in criminal activity. He's a victim, really, but he goes on the run. Hence the title, Hue and Cry. And it's a strange book, but it's very interesting. It has this feel about it that's at the time must have been very modern and quite disconcerting to many readers. I don't think it sold many copies, but it's interesting because it's a good story, I think. But it's also got this interesting character and the effect of crime and involvement in crime on human nature that is flirted with in other Golden Age books of the early 30s. But Bruce really delves into it in quite an interesting and sometimes effective way.
Yeah, there is definitely a real sense that Bruce sort of writes things that are true to his life, as instanced in Too Much of Water by so many characters traveling down to Barbados and cricketers being on the boat, which he used to play and argue over with Patrick, as you detail in The Life of Crime. Was that something that you felt wasn't as common with authors? Because I feel like it's very famous for authors like Christie to have, her holidays displayed lavishly in her fiction. What was it that sets that portrayal apart, as you were kind of putting there?
Too Much of Water, it was his last novel. It also appeared after quite a long gap. And it's as if he was trying to recapture something of the past and writing, as I see it, a kind of Golden Age novel that in some ways is pretty conventional, as you say. There's talk about cricket, that famously sport with rules, laws that are very central, fair play and all that kind of thing. But it's really a throwback to the 30s, whereas his earlier work was looking ahead to the post-war era. So there's a kind of paradox there, as you well know. Too Much of Water explicitly references Christie and a Christie storyline. And that, again, is something that you don't find in his earlier book. Maybe it's because at this point, as you know, he spent many years in Barbados in an administrative position, quite senior, settled there for quite a long time. That's where that aspect of the story came from. But maybe we also see in Too Much of Water something of a nostalgia for the past. In the 30s, he is very political, very left-wing outlook, and he becomes jaded when the political world moves in a direction that disappoints him deeply, and his political views change. He moves away from the left. He becomes deeply disillusioned with Marxism and all that. And the radicalism has really gone by the time we come to Too Much of Water. So in some respects, he does a kind of reverse progression. The angry young man of the 30s has become somebody rather different.
Yeah, there's all this talk of, past bureaucrats who deserve to be thrown into the harbor throughout the book that doesn't end up having much to do with anything, but he's clearly very caught on the idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I guess one of the other interesting things about Too Much of Water, and we were talking about it a bit on the show, is that characters like Mr. Rottentosser, who's sort of the, I guess, opening antagonist is probably the briefest way I could describe him, and also one of the other victims, the young child, are both sort of portrayed in a way that I guess today we would read as like neurodivergency, mental health that we have more capable tools to deal with in the day. Is that something that you see reflected a lot in Bruce and Patrick's work?
It's probably not as prevalent as it is in the work of some other writers of the time. If you read somebody like J.J. Connington, one of the giants of the Golden Age, the 20s and the 30s, his portrayal of neurodivergency, is very, very far removed from what we would expect and write. Today, he treats these characters as comic relief, and he does it in a very powerful, but today rather distasteful way. Those books are often very good, but the portrayal of some of the characters, subsidiary characters, tends to be unsatisfactory. I think you don't get this to quite the same extent in Patrick and Bruce, partly, I think, because Patrick and to a lesser extent Bruce saw themselves as disfigured in some way, particularly after the accident that occurred to Patrick. And Bruce also ended up in hospital, as I talk about in The Life of Crime. It was this curious, almost symbiotic relationship between the two of them. And it comes out in various ways, some of them quite unexpected. I think, of course, one of the most interesting things today is that if Patrick is remembered for anything above all, he's probably remembered for gaslight. And of course, now the term gaslighting is almost a modern cliche. But that idea, the gaslight idea, was given to Patrick by Bruce because it was something that featured as a subsidiary plot element in one of Bruce's early stories. So you see that Bruce indirectly is responsible for this term that is now common currency in language.
There will be more Martin Edwards next week on the show. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Stick around. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. We are talking Bruce Hamilton's Too Much of Water. Chapters 5 to 8. Herds is in the hot seat as we discuss this boat-bound mystery, a tribute to Agatha Christie's The ABC Murders. But by what means? Herds is in the process of figuring out. You had a realization earlier during this episode. Would you care to share what that realization is with us?
The realization that I came to as I was talking about how all these murders have to do with swimming and they're in pools and stuff, I've been trying to figure out, because I'm fairly certain on who the killer is. I feel like the how is not terribly complicated. We're walking around bashing people with probably whatever's lying around on the boat and tossing them in the water, frequently dead or unconscious before they get into the water, which is exciting. But the connection that I'm looking at here, the thing that I've realized, is that Terry Gardner keeps talking about what a great swimmer he is. He's the only character, other than Rotten Tosser, I guess, who really talks about how much they love being at sea and swimming and water.
So I can see where you're going here, Herds, but I also feel like Terry is kind of too obvious to be the villain. We have that entire thing before Esteban dies where like we have that back and forth with his cat and he jumps into the water and, as you say, talks about how excellent of a swimmer he is.
He is an excellent swimmer.
And he's constantly referring to the child as being like a devil. I feel like it would just be too much for him to be the killer.
I think this book is silly enough. It's got enough comedy bits. I think we can go with a more obvious killer. But at the same time, the book is also putting in a ton of work to try and make him look innocent or try to make him seem like he's weak. I've got this in the character notes that you wrote, is a weak character. Physically weak, you might say.
My notes say he thinks himself very weak, but also thinks himself to be a very strong swimmer.
But he's telling people that he's weak. That's the point. This is something that I did notice. I have in my notes, check the card games, because he gets into multiple card games, some kind of sport game. It doesn't matter. But in all of them, he has a partner. And he is noted in the game that he plays with Edgar as his partner that he is an extremely clever player. He's a borderline genius, more importantly, a surprise.
Yeah, they like sit down and he's like, oh, I've not really played this before. You guys are going to have to walk me through it. And then he walks them.
Cleans them out. But then as soon as the murders start happening, he starts doing very poorly and he starts getting very self-deprecating, almost as though he realizes he's made a mistake in the first game by playing so well and he wants to downplay his skill. So in terms of that theme of like following the tune, it's got to be Terry, especially considering that early face-off with the detective. We're playing a bit of a twist on that where we're playing with the detective to defeat the other characters in Bridge. But the early face-off with the detective where we recognize the killer's skill.
This is like the Sherlock Moriarty show each other how great they are.
So good at chess. So then we can compare Bridge to murder later on.
I mean, like, he is obviously in that grid of characters that I mentioned earlier, listed as impossible for
but
one
there
of
was
the
a
crimes.
20-minute
but like
break.
You could so easily have lied. I don't think that's worth.
There was literally a 20-minute break. There's such a big deal made of Annie and her like, I'm going to do a performance in the middle. And she pulls out at the last minute because that 20-minute break is when he goes off to go and kill Sweet, right?
I guess the question that I have, though, is that he seems like a pretty plausible killer if you're willing to overlook the fact that he's like deeply obvious to the point where I'd normally rule him out. What's his motive? Is his motive that he likes swimming and is just a serial killer? That feels a little thin on the ground.
Here's the thing. I've been thinking about the ABC murders.
I don't know why you'd be thinking about that.
I've been thinking about the ABC murders, and I've been trying to figure out what's going on with the cover of this book. Because there's this woman on the front of the cover, and she's staring at the camera. She looks very important. She's got the water and the life preserver behind her. So here's the thing.
I don't think I've looked at the cover once this entire...
Well, you should have looked, because I think that's Yvonne Easthope.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness. With that, like, green eyeshadow. Oh, that's... What a look.
It's great. It's very striking. But yeah, I think that the reason why we're, like, setting up all of these awful characters to get killed is to foreshadow the most awful character of all, Yvonne Easthope, being killed. Now, I assume the reveal at the end is going to be that we're killing these other characters so that Yvonne can be like the main target. There is a mention of Bobby, which is Yvonne's divorced husband, and it's from Terry Gardner, so of course it's important. And he says, Yvonne is eminently bedworthy, but she's a bit above my weight, you know. Above poor Bobby's too, I'm afraid. Bobby Easthope, her husband. We're up at the house together. Connection. Great chap, not exactly brain of Britain, but one of the best. Here's the thing. I can't say that I fully understand the why here, but it's clearly for Bobby. I have two thoughts. Either it's just to help Bobby get a bunch of money from his divorced wife dying.
Yeah. Insurance payout. Nice. Classic.
Yeah, the insurance payout. That's a classic Christie one. The other, we've made a lot of discussion around characters who may or may not be the gay. Maybe this is a gay
You think Terry
thing?
and Bobby are gay?
Maybe. He goes out of his way to say that Yvonne is eminently bedworthy. I feel like that's an indication that he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Okay, well, here's my flip side to this, Herds, is
What's the flip
that,
side?
Terry is listed as impossible, and I said, he could have lied, but Yvonne is clearly set up to be the arch villain here in terms of the, like, motive of the story, but she's only improbable, and it seems like we've set up the two men that she's, like, playing, Maurice and Hugh, to be the ones that could take the fall. So could it not be her, and Terry is there meant to point us towards her as the killer?
I think that's very unlikely. Well, first off, Yvonne doesn't have any connection to water. She's just being the worst.
Because the other thing we know about Yvonne is that she is very good at moving everyone around the boat. Like, she'll tell one person to go one way and she'll go another so that she can switch between her two romances. Like, she is orchestrating everyone's movements around the boats.
Here's the thing. I would love to do a backflip and switch over to Yvonne's side if you weren't the person who's supposed to be misleading me this week, but I do like the idea of her being the killer. I'm not sure why you put the killer on the front cover of your book, though. I know that's meta reasoning, but I don't feel like that's something I would do.
Okay, well, here's my last question for you, Herds. Do you think Terry, in your theory here, is in it against Yvonne, or do you think he's in it with Yvonne?
I suppose the question is, if we're leaning on a tribute to the ABC murders, I feel like there has to be a murder that's particularly important compared to the others. If he's siding with Yvonne, then the fourth murder would have to be Gott, right? But then I don't know what that achieves.
Fourth murder?
I feel like there has to be, right?
There's a fourth murder in this book, Herds?
I feel like there must be. If we're doing an ABC, then there has to be an important murder. And so far, none of them have been particularly important.
So you think all of the kills we've had thus far are just distractions?
I do. Yes, I do. I think that we're seeing a distraction to cover up a fourth murder, and I think that's going to be Yvonne. I'm trying to think if killing Gott or even Maurice would have the same sort of effect, but I don't feel like it does.
All right. Well, in that case, Herds, if you think there is one final murder to come, I do have a question for you that wasn't relying on there being a fourth kill.
Uh-oh.
But that question is, from the evidence we have, how do we actually catch Terry Gardner should he be the killer?
That is a great question. I could say fingerprints, although secret love letters, I'm going to say secret letters to Bobby. That seems
Secret letters to Bobby.
Let's say secret letters to Bobby. Let's say there's some secret, very sexy letters that they wrote to each other.
Sexy gay letters to Bobby.
That sounds great.
I love it. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. We are here discussing Bruce Hamilton's Too Much of Water, and we will be back next week to discuss all the way to the end of that book. Stay tuned for that. You're listening to 2SER 107.3. Catch you then.